Good afternoon, readers. Welcome back to Tilly's Shelf. I am going to talk to you guys about murder. That's right, I'm going to be talking to you about the all-time queen of the English murder mystery. Yes, it's Agatha Christie. Agatha Christie books are almost like a guilty pleasure read for me. They are just delightful, witty little books, and they are so quintessentially English as well. My favourite Christie detective character is obviously Miss Marple, and my favourite book structure that she does is the books that are revolving around a rhyme. So it only makes sense that I love this book, A Pocket Full of Rye. This is from 1953. This is a Fontana Books edition from 1974, and this is what a paperback should be like. I love this format. No space is wasted in this. Like, the chapters just run onto each other. There's a really tiny font. There's just like 1-2 pages before you get into the story. And oh my god, it smells amazing. And on the back it says it originally cost 35p. So why are not all paperbacks like this? I could talk about a variety of things for this book, but instead I am going to look at one chapter in a very focused way, which is the chapter where there is about to be a second murder. This is a brilliant book, essentially, and by looking at one chapter I basically wanted to invite you to join me and experience some of the brilliance of the book. I'm going to read you the chapter in a minute. I've committed to reading it aloud for this video to work. Specifically, I want to look at how Christie sets up for a murder in this scene, and how she encourages us, in fact, to speculate and to come back to this chapter later in the book to examine it in more detail and use it as a space in which to test our own theories of who the murderer could be. I settle on the idea of looking at one chapter in depth for two reasons. I think it allows us to really critique how Christie builds that suspense and mystery and intrigue for which she is so famous. And it also allows me to film this video in a way that's not like overly generalised. I didn't want to just do a kind of a basic review, but that does not contain any spoilers. I have scripted this video very carefully. You're going to see me reading from my notes, and miraculously I think I managed to do it such that I'm not going to tell you who the first murder victim is, I'm not going to tell you who the second murder victim is, and I'm not, emphatically not going to tell you who the murderer is. I'm not even going to tell you which nursery rhyme this book is linked to, although if you know it, you probably already know it. I do not take responsibility for the comments, because obviously people will say what they will, but I will say, if you know the answer to if you know the solution to this murder mystery problem, please, please, please keep it to yourself. If you must say it, just like send it to me in an email or something, or just put spoiler in the title of your comment. The comments don't really have a title, do they? At the beginning of your comment. We are going to look at chapter 11, part 2, which runs from page 65 to 69 in my edition. It is just 4 short pages long, and it is a moment of drama in the book, even though not much happens in the chapter itself, and to me I see it as a turning point in the story. Christie uses a lot of short chapters and chapter parts in her books, and normally each one revolves around one key incident, such as the decision of a character to go to a certain place or do a certain thing, or the discovery of something that is thought to be a clue, and so on. And what this does is it increases the page turneriness, that's not a word, but you get what I mean, of the books, because one important thing happens and maybe there's a bit of a cliffhanger and you're left thinking, or I'm left thinking, oh, I'll just quickly read the next chapter and find out what's going on with that. And before I know it, I've read the whole book. So before I plunge into the chapter, I will just quickly set up the scene for you and introduce you to the dramatis persona. Of course, we are in an English country house. Typically it is the classic murder mystery setup. It is called Yew Tree Lodge, and it was built by this successful, if shady, businessman Rex Fortescue. There has been a murder, and as usual there is reason to believe that this was committed by one of the victim's close associates at or near Yew Tree Lodge. Most of the characters are already based at the house, but the 3 preceding chapters have each set up that a different character is moving towards coming to Yew Tree Lodge this evening. So we've got this sense of characters converging on Yew Tree Lodge for the evening, which is the evening, I think, of the day after the original murder. And we know that one way or another, if they're all coming to this one place, there is going to be some kind of clash or revelation. So down to the characters involved, there is Mary Dove, who is the housekeeper. She is not the fusty, old-fashioned kind of housekeeper. She is a young, intelligent woman who has realised that she can earn more and live better as a housekeeper than in any of the office jobs available to women at the time. So it's bits like that that are just little details of 1950s life in England that really add to the colour and the Englishness of these books and make them quite delightful to read. Then there is Gladys, the slightly dim and clumsy parlourmaid, and Mrs. Crump the cook, who mentions Mr. Crump, who is her husband, who is the butler. The women of the house are Adele Fortescue, the young, glamorous second wife of Rex Fortescue, Mrs. Percival Fortescue, who is the wife of Percival, the eldest son, so Mrs. Percival's own first name is Jennifer. Elaine Fortescue, who is Percival's sister, also lives in the house. Then there is also Lancelot Fortescue, who is the brother of Percival and Elaine, so there is a family of 3 siblings. And Lancelot has been away in Kenya for a couple of years, so just a little hint of British imperialist capitalism from the period kind of makes its way into the book as well. Mr. Dubois, who lives nearby, is also mentioned, and it has been suggested that he and Adele Fortescue have been having a bit of an affair. I think that's everyone who comes on stage for this chapter at least. Now let's dive into chapter 11, part 2. I'm actually going to read this chapter aloud to you. I've timed it and it takes like 7 minutes, so if you want to skip it, go ahead and skip it. But I think this is the easiest way of showing you what goes on in the chapter without it being too confusing, and just so that later on when I'm talking about the techniques and stuff, you will know what I'm referring to. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Mary Dove came slowly down the big staircase. She paused a moment at the window on the half landing from which she had seen Inspector Neale arrive on the preceding day. Now, as she looked out in the fading light, she noticed a man's figure just disappearing round the yew hedge. She wondered if it was Lancelot Fortescue, the prodigal son. He had perhaps dismissed his car at the gate and was wandering round the garden, recollecting old times there before tackling a possibly hostile family. Mary Dove felt rather sympathetic towards Lance. A faint smile on her lips, she went on downstairs. In the hall she encountered Gladys, who jumped nervously at the sight of her. "Was that the telephone I heard just now?" Mary asked. "Who was it?" "Oh, it was a wrong number. Thought we were the laundry." Gladys sounded breathless and rather hurried. "And before that it was Mr. Dubois. He wanted to speak to the mistress." "I see." Mary went on across the hall. Turning her head, she said, "It's tea time, I think. Haven't you brought it in yet?" Gladys said, "I don't think it's 4:30 yet, is it, miss?" "It's 20 minutes to 5. Bring it in now, will you?" Mary Dove went on into the library where Adele Fortescue, sitting on the sofa, was staring at the fire, picking with her fingers at a small lace handkerchief. Adele said fretfully, "Where's tea?" Mary Dove said, "It's just coming in." A log had fallen out of the fireplace, and Mary Dove knelt down at the grate and replaced it with the tongs, adding another piece of wood and a little coal. Gladys went out into the kitchen, where Mrs. Crump raised a red and wrathful face from the kitchen table where she was mixing pastry in a large bowl. "The library bell's been ringing and ringing. Time you took the tea in, my girl." All right, Mrs. Crump." "What I'll say to Crump tonight," muttered Mrs. Crump. "I'll tell him off." Gladys went on into the pantry. She had not cut any sandwiches. Well, she jolly well wasn't going to cut sandwiches. They'd got plenty to eat without that, hadn't they? 2 cakes, biscuits and scones and honey. Fresh black market farm butter. Plenty without her bothering to cut tomato or foie gras sandwiches. She'd got other things to think about. Fair-tempered Mrs. Crump was in, all because Mr. Crump had gone out this afternoon. Well, it was his day out, wasn't it? Quite right of him, Gladys thought. Mrs. Crump called out from the kitchen, "The kettle's boiling its head off. Aren't you ever going to make that tea?" "Coming." She jerked some tea without measuring it into the big silver pot, carried it into the kitchen and poured the boiling water on it. She added the teapot and the kettle to the big silver tray and carried the whole thing through to the library, where she set it on the small table near the sofa. She went back hurriedly for the other tray with the eatables on it. She carried the latter as far as the hall when the sudden jarring noise of the grandfather clock preparing itself to strike made her jump. In the library, Adele Fortescue said querulously to Mary Dobb, "Where is everybody this afternoon?" "I really don't know, Mrs. Fortescue. Miss Fortescue came in some time ago. I think Mrs. Percival's writing letters in her room," Adele said pettishly. Writing letters, writing letters. That woman never stops writing letters. She's like all people of her class. She takes an absolute delight in death and misfortune. Ghoulish, that's what I call it. Absolutely ghoulish." Mary murmured tactfully, "I'll tell her that tea is ready." Going towards the door, she drew back a little into the doorway as Elaine Fortescue came into the room. Elaine said, "It's cold," and dropped down by the fireplace, rubbing her hands before the blaze. Mary stood for a moment in the hall. A large tray with cakes on it was standing on one of the hall chests. Since it was getting dark in the hall, Mary switched on the light. As she did so, she thought she heard Jennifer Fortescue walking along the passage upstairs. Nobody, however, came down the stairs, and Mary went up the staircase and along the corridor. Percival Fortescue and his wife occupied a self-contained suite in one wing of the house. Mary tapped on the sitting-room door. Mrs. Percival liked you to tap on doors, a fact which always roused Crump's scorn of her. Her voice said briskly, "Come in." Mary opened the door and murmured, "Tea is just coming in, Mrs. Percival." She was rather surprised to see Jennifer Fortescue with her outdoor clothes on. She was just divesting herself of a long camel hair coat. "I didn't know you'd been out," said Mary. Mrs. Percival sounded slightly out of breath. "Oh, I was just in the garden, that's all, just getting a little air. Really, though, it was too cold. I shall be glad to get down to the fire. The central heating here isn't as good as it might be. Someone must speak to the gardeners about it, Miss Dove." "I'll do so," Mary promised. Jennifer Fortescue dropped her coat on a chair and followed Mary out of the room. She went down the staircase ahead of Mary, who drew back a little to give her precedence. In the hall, rather to Mary's surprise, she noticed the tray of eatables was still there. She was about to go out to the pantry and call to Gladys, when Adele Fortescue appeared in the doorway of the library, saying in an irritable voice, "Aren't we ever going to have anything to eat for tea?" Quickly, Mary picked up the tray and took it into the library, disposing the various things on low tables near the fireplace. She was carrying the empty tray out to the hall again when the front door bell rang. Setting down the tray, Mary went to the door herself. If this was the prodigal son at last, she was rather curious to see him. How unlike the rest of the Fortescues, Mary thought as she opened the door and looked up into the dark, lean face and the faint, quizzical twist of the mouth. She said quietly, "Mr. Lancelot Fortescue?" "Himself?" Mary peered beyond him. "Your luggage?" "I've paid off the taxi. This is all I've got." He picked up a medium-sized zip bag. Some faint feeling of surprise in her mind, Mary said, "Oh, you did come in a taxi. I thought perhaps you'd walked up. And your wife?" His face set in a rather grim line. Lance said, "My wife won't be coming. At least not just yet." "I see. Come this way, will you, Mr. Fortescue? Everyone is in the library having tea." She took him to the library door and left him there. She thought to herself that Lancelot Fortescue was a very attractive person. A second thought followed the first. Probably a great many other women thought so too. Thank you for listening to that. Thank you for enduring my reading aloud. Now I am going to do your one spoiler. I'm going to try and put a little sign so that I think my little things that I have stuck on the walls aren't really tolerating the heat today. This one's just fallen down and the other one fell down earlier. I'm just going to give up and have a boring background. What was I saying? I'm going to try and put a little spoiler warning icon in the corner, and then if you want to mute it, and then unmute when that icon goes. By the end of this chapter, a murder has occurred, even though we as readers have not seen it. In fact, very little actually does happen that we do see in this chapter. I already mentioned that every chapter has a key point, but this one almost doesn't. It's just people moving around. The death that I mentioned is offstage, like almost all murder mystery deaths. As readers, we don't know yet that there is a death, but we are focused in on a number of smaller mysteries. Spoiler over. I actually counted 16 minor mysteries in this story, which is things like, why did Jennifer go out for a walk and where did she go? What was up with that wrong number on the telephone? Things like that. So there's a lot of suspicious points, a lot of suspicious behaviour, and we are left thinking, is this point going to turn out to be a vital clue, or is it going to be that point? And particularly, I think when you've read chapter 12, when a lot more stuff starts to turn up, and chapter 13, which is when Miss Marple arrives, you end up going back to chapter 11 and looking at the details of it and thinking which ones of these points are important. I had to go tie up my hair, it was starting to get on my nerves a little bit. We started with Mary Dove walking slowly down the staircase, and it's like we are walking onto set with her in what is quite a staged scene. The narrative flits from one character to another very freely in this book and in Christie's works in general. I think you would technically describe this approach as free indirect discourse, in that we keep the omniscient third person narrator, but we also see a lot of little bits of each character's individual thoughts. This is quite genius really for murder mysteries, as it allows us to get to know each individual and learn their motivations, but it also moves the narrative elsewhere just when a character is about to either reveal their guilt or prove their innocence. So everyone stays a focus of suspicion, and particularly everyone who we are not with at the moment could be doing anything. They are very much open to suspicion if we can't see them. In this chapter, the narrative passes from Mary Dove to Gladys and back to Mary Dove very fluidly. It's like as they pass each other in the hallway, they pass the narrator between themselves. And the hallway is a very important space in this chapter. There are just a couple of side stages like Jennifer's room and the kitchen, but really the focal point is the hallway. And if you picture it, it's got the front door, it's also got a back door as well. It's also got the window on the stairway. The stairs then lead onto the bedrooms, and it's got downstairs the doors to the library and the way to the kitchen. So it's a real transit space, and it's got a lot of potential entrance and exit points. It's a place of flux, and it's a place where people are constantly coming in and out, moving through that space without really stopping there. So nobody's really there long enough to be able to say who has or hasn't been through that hallway. For example, we see Jennifer Fortescue upstairs, but we never see her come in, so we get this idea that that is not a monitored space, and it would actually be the ideal place for a person with nefarious intentions. Nefarious or nefarious? Anyway, to be moving through that space in order to pursue whatever they're planning on doing. Murderer or not murderer, there is a lot of movement in this scene for every character. I always think text which states exactly and very clearly who is going where and doing what in a physical space is very much like stage directions, and I definitely think that's the case here. You may have noticed when I was reading it aloud, it was almost a bit challenging that certain locations came up again and again. It's very precise, and it's even got like Mary Dove steps aside so that another character can come past her. It also says the order that they come down the stairs in, and that's like a nod to Old English manners. And this precision about their movement is about heightening the reader's consciousness of what might be a clue, encouraging the reader to play the detective really, because later on it might become significant the exact positions that people were in at a certain point. So we almost feel like we should be taking notes on who's going where, when. And that's effectively what Inspector Neil, the detective, will be doing eventually if he comes back to revisit this scene. So as human beings, we detect with our senses, and these senses are very important in this chapter too. Elaine and Jennifer both mention that they are cold, and this, obviously the idea of the sensation of cold reminds us that the story is set in November, but it also gives us this sensation of chill and uneasiness, which generally accompanies coldness. There's the fire in the library that needs to be put back together almost. We have the impression that the glow of the fire both warms and protects the people sitting in the library, but it's obviously not perfect in doing that job. Then there is sound. There's the sudden jarring noise of the grandfather clock, and there's also the slightly more suspect sound of Mary thinking she hears Jennifer Fortescue walking about upstairs. With sound and sight, the characters can't trust their senses. For example, Mary Dove again spots someone coming through the garden, but the light is fading and she can't necessarily see who it is or what they're doing. Later on, she has to switch on the lights in the hall. It is getting dark. Things are becoming obscured, a little bit like the story itself as it becomes more complicated. Taste also comes in a little bit with Gladys thinking over the food that she's preparing for tea. The reference to black market butter is another bit of British colour because rationing after the war went on until 1954, so we get the sense of the wealth and unscrupulousness of this family in that they are acquiring black market butter. The food description also links to the rhyme again. I didn't actually know that this rhyme had 2 verses until I read this book, but if you do know the second verse of the rhyme, that description will probably heighten your curiosity and also your anxiety about what is about to happen. I think Christie is definitely leading your thoughts in certain different directions here, depending on whether or not you are aware of the rhyme and its increasing presence in the story. As well as physical senses, we also get peaks of the emotions of the narrating characters. So we've got Gladys's petty resentment of her employers, Mary Dove's mild surprise comes up on a couple of occasions as well, and there are also little drips of characterisation, like Adele's self-centred concerns about getting her tea ready and her fretful picking at the handkerchief. This all feeds into what we already know about these characters, because we are several chapters in now into the investigation of the first murder. Most readers probably already have their speculations and their beliefs about who the murderer might be. Everything, even the fact of being cold or having a quizzical twist to the face or anything like that, could be some kind of clue and could focus us in on one person, making us single them out to be the killer. This also comes into play with Gladys and Jennifer being both a bit out of breath. We have to wonder why, what extra strain are they under that's putting them out of breath. So again, we see Christie building up the colour of the story, throwing in a few adverbs here like tactfully and querulously that give us certain impressions about certain people and actively encourages us to build up theories. Another thing that we've got in this chapter is repeated references to time and the clock. Tea is running late, people appear to be missing and delayed who should be there, and the sense of lateness adds to a sense of suppressed urgency in this chapter. Gladys's forgetfulness of the time serves a double purpose when she says, "I don't think it's 4:30 yet, is it, miss?" This helps with her characterisation because it leads to us seeing her as the sloppy and slightly distracted maid, but it also deliberately draws our attention to the clock and to the actual time in a way which we know will become important. In a murder mystery, in a scene like this, time is always important, and precision with regards to time especially. We get the hint from the repeated mentions that we should be bearing these times in mind. They are likely to come up again. And when they do come up, it will probably be with Inspector Neil with his notebook saying, "Where were you when the clock struck 5? What time did things happen? What order did things happen in?" These are going to be key in the detective process. So the flag of time from Mary Dove makes it stick in our minds. Then the clock sounding later when it strikes 5 startles us too. We have been with Gladys in the kitchen and carrying trays about for a full 20 minutes, and a lot can happen in 20 minutes. We've been with the imprecise Gladys, barely noticing the time passing, instead of with Mary Dove with her very precise mental notes of who's going where. Thus the tension is raised, and the writing approach in this chapter contributes to that and helps to hurry us through time. A lot of it is in dialogue, and a lot of the dialogue is in quite simple questions and answers. We're getting little bits of information requested by one character and provided by another, but of course every time that question is answered, apart from the rhetorical kind of questions, which I've counted about 3 of, we have to ask ourselves whether the response can be trusted. There is a lot of misleading in this chapter, including on the part of the author. Like I've said, there were about 16 little miniature mysteries, and not all of those miniature mysteries will be important, including even things that I've focused on, or there has been a focus on, there appears to be a focus on in the chapter, may not be important. So the author is kind of leading us down little avenues that might not necessarily be the right direction. So we don't know what to prioritise in our mental investigations. Okay then, that was a quick look at everything or some of the things that are at play in chapter 11, part 2 of A Pocket Full of Rye. I feel like I've been quite vague and fuzzy at times, mainly because I'm trying really hard not to give anything concrete away, but I hope it has showed you what clever techniques are at play in this chapter and made you think a little bit about whether this works for you in terms of building suspense and making you speculate on the likely results. I found it quite fun to discuss, at least. What I would like to know is, please, without spoiling it for your fellow readers if you have read the book, based on the information from this chapter, who do you think the second murder victim will be, and who do you think that murderer is? But if you can back up your idea or your theory with things that have been mentioned in this video, then that would be really cool. I would be very interested to hear it. I would also like to know if you have a favourite Christie book or a favourite alternative murder mystery author and why that is. Do please share that with me, and if you think that these techniques work or they don't work, if some of them you think are overdone or underdone, did it build tension, did it build suspense, did it build intrigue for you? I look forward to hearing anything you have to say in the matter. In the meantime, I will be continuing to read the 5th season, which I'm loving. I'm actually amazed that I managed to put it down for long enough to sit inside and film this video. I'm going to go back out into the sunshine and read that. I will speak to you soon. Thank you very much for watching. I'm going to be talking about the all-time queen of the English murder mystery and my cat, apparently. Jeez.